Okay, so the meeting is now being recorded. For the recording, this is good. So the recording is all going to be up on MediaSpace. If you check the course website, and we'll talk about this at the end of the lecture, uh, just general logistics, where videos are going to be, where other stuff is going to be. So we can talk about that at the end of the lecture today. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. Our goal today will primarily be introduction, and we'll sort of build off of that for future discussions. So, as mentioned, the main topic is going to be basic introduction to machine learning. We'll talk about our first machine learning algorithm today, which is k-nearest neighbors. Apparently, there are audio problems again. Okay. I'll need to figure out what to do with chat, but we'll learn over time how to balance the listening and the answering questions. So we'll primarily talk about we'll do a high-level intro to machine learning. We'll talk about k-nearest neighbors, and then we'll leave the last chunk of class for discussion about course information and just general course setup. The main reference for this course is Kevin Murphy's book. Sorry, the main reference for this lecture is chapter 1 of a probabilistic machine learning and probabilistic perspective. Okay, so for questions, actually, I should add, I will encourage and try to keep up with using the chat feature if you have questions, and I'll try to keep an eye on that and try to answer questions. The other side of that is I suggest not spamming it, at least for now, till we figure out maybe an alternative or a better way to easily answer chat questions. Okay, so there are many ways to think and understand about machine learning. I think appropriate way in terms of practice is to think about sort of the process of creating new machine learning. And here's a XKCD post that I like because it discusses something about what is easy and what is hard about getting sort of machine learning systems to actually work. This is about generic software, but I think it's appropriate for machine learning as well. And so you can read it here. What it says is when the user takes a photo, the app should check whether they're in a national park, And the software engineer is saying, well, yeah, that's easy. Just a quick lookup, done in a few hours. And then next it says, well, we should check whether the photo is of a bird. And immediately the complexity goes from a few hours to a research team and 5 years. And so when designing software code algorithms, it can be hard to explain or hard to reason about what is easy and what is sort of a huge undertaking. And the difference between the two can be nuanced. And we'll see a bit of this as we talk about machine learning. Okay, so this is a big class, even the sort of synchronous part of the lecture. I see 162 people. There's a lot of different experience levels. So some folks know a lot about machine learning, potentially have completed projects in machine learning. Some folks, this is the first time that you're learning about it. We're going to attempt to do the breakout room now. We'll see how well that works. And what I'm hoping happens is some quick discussion in small groups about what machine learning is and what the applications of machine learning are. And then from that discussion, we will get some responses to maybe share with the whole group. So I will attempt breakout now. Okay. So it's going to be short. It's going to be about 30 seconds. Uh, okay, so let's give this a shot. Let's see what happens. So just a few minutes discussing basics of machine learning and applications. Okay, so I think this is a fun experiment for me and maybe for you as well. So I think everyone is joining back. Okay, so let's try to do this through chat based on maybe what you discussed in your breakout rooms. Can someone give me, oh, okay. Can someone give me some answers to either one of these questions based on either what you knew or what you had in the discussion? I think I'll use chat for now, and then again, we're experimenting a bit. We'll see if this doesn't work in the future because I think chat is very busy. Okay, so approximating functions based on expected inputs and outputs. I think that's very close to a lot of the practical applications of machine learning. I think applications, of course, image classification, clustering data. Okay, robotics, training a computer to understand patterns. Maybe give a couple more seconds for other thoughts. Okay, so I think there's a lot in terms of applications, I think, that are sort of all around. Vision and NLP, I think, are great ones. Lots of modern applications and things like facial recognition. To some extent, where you can sort of try to write rules that are hard to fully describe in logic, you want to try and automate. I think video games are a great sort of timely application. Stuff with a lot of edge cases, I think that's tricky. In principle, yes. In practice, it's a little bit messy, and we'll have a chance to talk about that maybe later in the semester. And of course, our William government. Okay, so I think that's a fun discussion. Thank you. I'm going to continue lecture. So according to Wikipedia, which by some accounts is the best source of information, machine learning is about using statistical techniques to give computer systems the ability to learn. So improve performance in a specific task without being explicitly programmed. So that's one definition of machine learning. A somewhat more formal definition, which we'll use to some extent, but I think it will be important for contextualizing how one thinks about the problem, is by Tom Mitchell in the machine learning book. On the website, you can see this is one of the sources. And it says that a computer program is set to learn from experience E with respect to some class of task T and performance measure P. If its performance on the task T is measured by P, improves with experience. These seem like sort of weird semantics and maybe nuance, but as we go through the class, it'll be clear that these nuances are actually quite important in terms of sort of modern thinking of what machine learning is and how we think about how to solve machine learning problems. In particular, we'll talk a lot about performance measures and sort of how critical they are for reasoning about machine learning, and the role of experience, which is right now somewhat abstract and will end up being described as data, and data that we're actually using to train machine learning models. Okay, so we also talked about applications for a few minutes and got lots of great suggestions for various applications of machine learning. So machine learning shows up in chess as a good example of a system that was sort of much bigger and richer, but used machine learning underneath to solve some subproblems. So many of you may be aware of Deep Blue, which was a chess playing program by IBM that was sort of brought up around 1997. So it uses a bunch of systems, but one of the key ideas that it uses are based on machine learning. And maybe follow up to that would be something like Watson by IBM in 2011. That was for playing Jeopardy. So used sort of question answering type systems. It used natural language processing quite a ton. And sort of an interesting application and close to real world application of using machine learning. Things like Atari games, I saw games as an option when we were doing the Q&A. So we'll talk about, when we talk about reinforcement learning, we'll go through a bit more detail about some of these applications. But a great example is something like what DeepMind published in 2015 using Atari games, or playing Atari games using machine learning type methods. And also similarly in 2016, playing Go, AlphaGo, which many of you may be aware of, again, using machine learning. Maybe more modern and timely applications are things like autonomous driving. So there's a lot of excitement from pretty much all of the car companies, excuse me, and maybe also lots of the tech companies in building autonomous driving, again, based on machine learning systems. So we're going to go through a real exercise for a couple of minutes on trying to get a computer to recognize whether there's a cat in an image. And so for our purposes, machine learning is going to look like, here's an image, so that's data. I'm going to push this through some algorithm. We often call it a model in machine learning. And we'll get notation down as we sort of walk through the class. But in many settings, machine learning algorithms are called models. And we'll talk a bit more about why they are as we move along. If your task is to ask whether there's a cat in this image, I think hopefully most of you will agree that the answer is yes. And so this is a good answer for whatever algorithm right now currently designed as a black box. Here's another image. Hopefully most of you will agree that this is also a cat. So the algorithm is working. And here's another image, and the algorithm should say no. So this is not a cat. So here is sort of an application of something that we want to get to. So we want to be able to create this black box so that it's given images and can spit out either a yes or a no about whether the image is an image of a cat. Okay, so for now, we're thinking of machine learning to make this a bit more formal. There's an input. You'll sometimes get this described as input data, sometimes as value, sometimes as vector. You also see this written often as features. So xi. X was typically some vector or something that can be sort of described as a vector, and I is the index for an example. So x1 is the first example, x2 is the second example, and so forth. Also, there is a target. So we're thinking of this kind of prediction problem where there is a label or an output. So in our setting, in the example I just described, this label was cat or dog. So Y can be cat or dog, or you can turn this into just a binary yes, no type answer. So this is the output of the machine learning algorithm. And our job is to get inputs, outputs, and come up with an algorithm that, given an input, can correctly specify the output. So this process of given inputs resulting in outputs is generally called prediction. Again, maybe old hat from some of you, but for many people, this might be new in terms of notation. In deep learning papers, and we'll spend some time talking about deep learning papers, this input-output mapping is often called inference. And it's just a quirk of history that deep learning papers often call this prediction process inference. Okay, so where is the learning happening here? So again, inputs, outputs, there's sort of black box right now, model algorithm in between. So the way that we specify what learning is, or what the model is generally through some parameters. So typically this is some vector, some set of values that specifies what the algorithm or the model can do or is doing. And so the process of learning is to find good values for those parameters. And a lot of the class will be spent talking about specific procedures and specific algorithms, both for designing good models and based on patterns that seem to be good for data, and also specific procedures and specific algorithms for fitting, finding good settings of these parameters, which is often what we call the learning process. And importantly, this is done based on a data set. So this is the experience thing that is in Tom Mitchell's description at the beginning of the lecture. So importantly, in machine learning, the patterns or the way that you specify what the model algorithm does is typically based on patterns that you've seen. I'm transforming the algorithm a bit. Patterns that the machine learning system has seen based on existing data sets. So in particular, we assume the existence of a data set of size n, and this n is important. It'll come up over and over again. N will generally be our notation for the size of a data set. And so each example comes as a pair, an input and output pair, xi, yi. And I assume that I see n of these, and based on these, I can tune the right parameters for my model. Okay, so now we know what the formal definition of a machine learning system is. How do we create a simple system to maybe recognize a cat in an image? So first, we need to know what an image looks like to a computer. So of course, all of you know that we see images as pictures. However, for a computer, an image doesn't show up as a picture. So here's a fun trick. You can import images into Excel, say a grayscale image, and look at what the image looks like. And what you'll see is that it's a set of numbers. And in particular, each grayscale is essentially telling you an intensity of how dark or light a particular pixel is, which is sort of a little block in the image. And so this picture of a cat, in terms of storage on a computer and sort of what a computer, quote unquote, sees, looks like a large array of numbers, where each number specifies the intensity of a particular pixel. It's very similar for color pictures. So many of you already know this, but if you look close enough, say at your cell phone screen or any screen, you'll see that the way that the screen is designed is to have blue, generally 3 colors, some variant of red, blue, green. And what happens is that the intensity of either red, blue, or green, and sort of how they're turned on and off in correlation to each other, ends up specifying the color of a particular pixel. So it's very similar to the grayscale, but now with 3 colors instead of just 1. And in particular, when we talk about and end up working on real applications with real images, we'll see how real data actually is described as these images with different colors. Okay, so now we know what a computer sees. Again, a computer sees these large arrays of numbers. Now, again, this is very different from what we see when we see an image. So we see an image as an object, and we are able to then use this to process and recognize objects. However, computers, again, just see this purely as numbers. So how can we get a computer to, say, recognize cats given a set of images? So here are a few pictures. The first row, these are all cats. Again, the computer doesn't get to see or understand this necessarily. What's happening is it's seeing these as arrays. So it's somewhat still, hopefully it's clear that it's quite challenging to describe purely in terms of pixels. It can be a challenging process to describe what a cat looks like. Now, if you could do this effectively, so if you could do this effectively, say by designing good rules, then you could come up with algorithms that were sort of purely hand-coded, that worked in a variety of situations, and sort of very reliably described cats and were able to recognize cats. So instead of trying to do this carefully by directly specifying patterns, one of the ways that you can try and sort of semi-brute force or solve this problem is to look at a lot of examples. So I look at a lot of examples of cats. I look at a lot of examples of not cats. And based on this, I'm able to tell whether a particular image is an image of a cat or not. And what you're hoping that the machine does is that as it sees more and more examples, it figures out the patterns that correlate with cats and figures out the patterns that correlate with not cats, and it's able to predict one or the other. So here's a real data set. It's not a big one, but you can imagine, let's imagine this was, say, thousands of examples of cats and not cats. So there's a very simple algorithm we could use in this particular image data set to try to predict whether this is a cat or not a cat. Can anyone see what this algorithm will be? And then I'll answer the question in a second. What might the algorithm, okay, so someone got it. So you can see that on the bottom left, all of the cat colors all the cat images have white pixels, white blocks of pixels. All of the non-cat images have black pixels. And so if the computer just recognized those pixels, it would be easy, and it can easily recognize sort of cat or not cat. There was a question about if I only see cats and I don't see the others. We won't cover this in this class, but there are algorithms for variations of problems that look like this. Sometimes they're called things like anomaly detection or one-class classification for keywords, if you want to look that up. It's not one of the topics we're going to cover here, but the idea is if I only see patterns of the instance, but I don't see patterns of sort of not the instance, then what you can do is train your algorithm just to tell when things look far away from examples that you've seen in the past. I'll defer additional discussion to maybe office hours or offline, but it is possible to do something meaningful with only one set of examples. For now, we'll stick with the simpler setting where I see examples of cats, and in this case, not cats. And now we have a simple algorithm. Can anyone guess what might go wrong if I train a model using this very simple algorithm of look at the bottom left square? Okay, we'll go along, and maybe we'll get to what might go wrong in this setting. Okay, so I see some answers. And the answer is yeah. So the answer is right. It's easy to end up with images that have cats in them but don't have the square. And we'll go through an example of this in a couple of seconds. So, so back to this example, I give you, I like this comment is actually quite good. Yeah, a chessboard becomes a cat, I guess, also if you're using bottom left squares. It's a good one. Okay, so let's recognize cats in this data set. Again, as many of you pointed out, there's a simple algorithm that you could build that will actually give you perfect classification error on this data set. So you'll have 0 classification errors, you have perfect classification. The bottom left is, you'll look at pixels there. If the bottom left is 0 or black, you say no, otherwise you say yes, it's a cat. I'll boringly go through some examples where the algorithm works quite well. So dog, it's perfect on the data set. It does what we wanted it to do. And the question that you might then ask, well, is this a good machine learning algorithm? And hopefully by the end of, well, definitely this lecture, I'd ask that you turn off your microphones for now, because I can't think of a way to make microphones work. So please turn off your microphones. As I was saying, on our data set, it'll be perfect. But hopefully by the end of this lecture, and definitely hopefully by the end of this class, we'll be able to understand why an algorithm like this, one, why this can happen, and two, why perfection on the data set is not good enough. But for now, suppose instead of getting this sort of hand-tuned sort of weird data sets, we now see one where it's closer to a real image. And so the bottom left square is not this giveaway pixel color. Now this algorithm doesn't know what to do. So it was perfect on the data set. We gave it something that was slightly different from examples that we've seen in the data set. And the failure that happens is that now the algorithm completely breaks. So doesn't have an answer for this setting. So here's a setting where it's perfect on the data set and it doesn't generalize to new data. Give me 1 second. Really quick, if you have your microphone on, actually I can just do it from here. If you have your microphone on, please mute. Okay. So again, this algorithm works perfect on the data, but doesn't generalize to other data. Meaning if I give it any data set that has patterns that are different from the very specific patterns that it's on the data set, it completely breaks. This idea of generalization is actually super important, and it's something that we'll spend a lot of time on in the class. The conclusion, at least from this part of the discussion, is as follows. So we've designed a simple classifier that works on our training data set, but doesn't work on real data because it depended on a pattern that is not sort of prevalent in real data. So our goal in sort of designing machine learning algorithms will be to find mappings which generalize. And this generalization idea will be quite critical because we're looking for mappings that work not just on the data that we get to see when we're training the model, but actually work when I deploy this algorithm into the wild and it gets to see new data. And we'll talk about how we try to design algorithms that have this property over the course of the class. So again, we're talking primarily about sort of just broadly about mechanisms and sort of very simple ideas for designing these. We'll have lectures both on sort of the procedure of generalization and also a bit on the theory of generalization on learning theory lectures later in the course of the class. Okay, so new cartoon break. So another XKCD cartoon. Here's a parody of often what you might think machine learning does. So this parody says, the left-hand side, this is your machine learning system. The machine learner, yep, pour your data into this big pile of linear algebra and then collect the answers on the other side. And then the left is saying, well, what if the answers are wrong? And the answer is, well, just stare at the pile until they start looking right. Hopefully by the time we're done with the class, we can ensure that we are not getting into a situation where we're building algorithms that end up looking like this. And again, one of the tools that we'll try to build on to avoid this particular situation is think about generalization. So what does your algorithm do when I deploy it in the world? Okay, So we're going to switch gears a bit from talking about sort of basic design of a simple machine learning algorithm to talk about how we try to categorize or classify or reason about what machine learning is. So there are many kinds of machine learning in the world. And often people try to categorize based on these kinds of machine learning. I think one of the most popular ways of categorizing machine learning is in terms of whether there is a label or not a label. So in many settings, you might have this cat dog label, and your task is to predict the output from the inputs. Sometimes you don't have a label, and your task is just to find structure in the data more broadly. We'll talk about both of these supervised and unsupervised settings. Supervised when you have a label, unsupervised when you do not. Another way that the world or community tries to categorize machine learning, is in terms of the complexity of the model. So we'll spend a bit of time talking about linear models in this class, but we'll also talk about nonlinear models. And the difference is whether the specification of what the model is doing is in terms of a linear function or a nonlinear function. And this difference can lead to quite different behavior and how we fit the models and how the model behaves. And so it's a high order bit when we try to think about how to categorize different kinds of machine learning models. It's also often common to categorize machine learning models in terms of whether we're predicting quote unquote simple things like labels, binary labels, versus complicated structured things like semantic segmentation, where we're trying to create sort of structured outputs, say, of all the pixels in an image, or we're trying to predict gene patterns or other kinds of highly structured objects. And there's often a big difference in terms of the way you construct algorithms when you're building either a sort of structured versus non-structured outputs. We'll talk a bit about this in the lecture as well. And another way that sort of machine learning algorithms often differ is in terms of how you choose to build your model. So in particular, even within supervised models specifically, there are classes of models that try to capture both the inputs and the outputs in terms of learning these relationships. And there are classes of models that only look at, that don't try to model the input distribution at all. Hopefully some of this will become clear as we go over lecture. The kinds of models that try to explicitly capture X and Y and are typically known as generative models. The kinds of models that only look at sort of Y given X, so just look at the predictive portion, are typically known as discriminative models. Again, this would be one of the topics we'll spend some time on over the course of the lecture. Okay, so let's talk a bit about classification tasks. So there are lots of different kinds of classification tasks out in the world. We've already given lots of examples of machine learning algorithms. I wonder actually if we can try. Okay, so I will quickly explain from a question, independent versus structured. So let me do that very quickly and then come back to this. Okay, so the distinction between independent and structured roughly corresponds to the complexity of the label that you're predicting. It's probably easiest to explain by examples, but just to be precise, a good example of a structured output is a prediction of a graph of some kind, where the important part of the distinction is that the space of outputs is quite large and also has a lot of underlying sort of correlations built in. So the space of graphs, for instance, of a certain size is a pretty large space of sort of all possible edge connections that you can have for a certain graph. And if your task is to predict something like a set of graphs, this is a highly complex prediction task, and we often think about this as a structured prediction task. Whereas the alternative is, instead of predicting the graph itself, you could imagine predicting each edge separately. And this would be a simpler, say, yes, no, does the edge exist? And as we go over lecture, we'll talk about settings where if I'm given a complex output that I'm interested in predicting, We'll try to gain some intuition, though I would say that this is still a tricky problem. But we'll try to gain some intuition about when it's best to try and separate this complex problem into small independent problems and solve them independently versus when the structure really does matter and you need to actually predict the entire structure as is. So that we have a lecture structure prediction, which I think is either right before or right after the midterm, where we'll build up to that a bit and then we'll talk in some detail about what structure prediction is. Any other questions on this page? Just general categorization of machine learning algorithms. Okay. So classification tasks, I think, are by far the most common machine learning algorithms. One example is something like a spam filter, where your goal is to predict for a particular email, whether it's spam or not spam. And so this would be a classification problem. I'm trying to predict yes, no for spam given an email. There are many others, and I think many that you can come up with easily. Things like diagnosis type problems. A good example may be trying to trying to diagnose, say, whether there's cancer based on maybe an image or other healthcare factors that you might have available. And so this is an example of something where you're trying to solve a classification task. So any task where the goal is to go from inputs to a discrete label, discrete meaning sort of one of k categories, is typically considered a classification task. So just to be clear, typically if I give you input and the y is in some sort of, so it's one, I always do this where I write, I'll try to write it straight. So in particular, a bit of notation here. There's 1, 2, all the way through k. So any setting where the goal of the prediction problem is to predict this sort of k label type output is a classification problem. And so we'll spend a lot of time, I think, talking about classification tasks because by far, I think, in practice, they're the most popular applications of machine learning algorithms. Apart from classification, is anyone else sort of aware of other kinds of settings? So what else might I be interested in predicting if I wasn't predicting categories? Maybe in the chat. Yeah, so regression, I think, is the most common other one where you're interested in predicting regression. Typically then the y is typically some real valued quantity. So R is just good to set notation now. So R is mathematical notation for the reals. So some number that's real valued. So regression, I think, is the other very common type setting. Best action for reinforcement learning can typically be posed as a classification problem. We'll talk about this a lot more when we get to that part. Also, it's useful to sort of think of reinforcement learning kind of as its own thing because the difference, I want to be wary of getting too far ahead of myself, but reinforcement learning ends up having quite different semantics from the rest of machine learning because you get to interact with the system and sort of repeatedly make predictions and sort of use those predictions to query the world and change the model. Whereas in machine learning, actually this is important, so it's good this came up. In machine learning, as a general rule of thumb, we think of the process of developing and applying machine learning as usually a one-shot kind of process. Even if in practice, one repeats and tries to refine. Typically, for the kinds of machine learning problems that we'll mostly cover in class, we think of these as I give you a whole data set. I learn my algorithm, my machine learning algorithm once, and then I apply this sort of forward in the future as my prediction, as opposed to a setting where you might be doing things continuously. We are not going to talk about, there are entire sort of literature, and some of us here at faculty work on things like online learning, but the goal is to actually learn and predict at the same time. This class won't cover it, but I'm happy to give pointers to places where, either other classes or other places where you can learn more about that. Okay, so the most common settings for machine learning, again, are classification and regression. I mentioned briefly structured predictions, so things like graphs, which are sort of complex high-dimensional objects that are not well described by either classes or regression, can also be often tackled using machine learning, but typically using things like structured prediction type applications. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to address machine learning problems in a very simple approach. So we're going to go over our first non-trivial machine learning algorithm now. We've already covered one, but it was not a very good one, which is this picture classification based on the leftmost pixel. Now we're going to come up or try to describe a real sort of machine learning algorithm that we expect to be effective in practice in a real problem. So this is known as the nearest neighbor algorithm. It's fairly simple, mostly intuitive, but I think surprisingly effective in many settings, and I think often a good way to build classification and potentially even regression algorithms. Okay, so as we specified, whenever we're building machine learning algorithms, at least for the beginning of this class, we're going to think about having access to a data set. So inputs, outputs, xi, yi, a data set of size n. And our goal is come up with a procedure somehow such that if I give you a new data point, I can then predict the label of that data point. And so what we're hoping to do is to come up with this algorithm that is able to reliably predict outputs from new inputs. Okay, so we're going to come up with a simple approach for choosing y. And for nearest neighbors, the way that it does this is the label for a new data point is fixed by, so remember, the k superscript is the represents an example. So this is unfortunate. Okay, so we're going to choose y. I'll get to the unfortunate thing in 2 seconds. I apologize. Okay, so we're going to choose y as follows. We're going to choose a label by taking our data sets, which is, in this case, just our features, looking for the feature that is closest to this example. So I'm interested in classifying a particular example X. I search through my entire database. So I look through my entire data set and I find the xi that is closest to my X. So if you want to visualize this, you can think about this as I have a data set of all of my examples. And if I want to specify, I want to predict a new example, say this plus, what I'm going to do is search in my database and look to all of the and then including the points that are farther away. I'm attempting to avoid too much clutter. And then I'm going to find the point that's closest. So say it's that point. And then I'm going to look up the label for that point, which is this step here. And that becomes my label for that particular data point. I'm told that my voice keeps breaking. Yeah, so I'm going to repeat the last part. Please tell me if this happens. Again, I think what's happening is internet on my side, unfortunately, not yours. But I guess it's one of the things we'll have to deal with. Apologies for this. But please let me know when this happens because it probably will happen again. Okay, so again, the procedure is I take my data set, I search, interesting. I search for, within the whole data set for the point that's closest to the point I'm hoping to predict. So what I drew here was the plus in the middle is the point that we're hoping to predict. And I search through and find the point that's closest. Based on the points that's closest, I will need to figure out how to separate out discussion from questions from the class. It's a little bit distracting, but I'll figure this out over time. So it's a bit of a test bed, but we'll figure this out as we go along. There are a lot of questions about distance metrics. I'll get to them in 2 seconds. I think I'm actually really happy that that's coming up, because that's a really important point. And we'll talk about this choice of distance metrics in 2 seconds. So I'm going to, again, just describe the algorithm because of a bit of lagging to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So I have a data set size n, all of my xi's. I have inputs and outputs for each one. So each I has an x, which is the feature, and y, which is the target. The way nearest neighbor works is for a particular new x, the point I'm trying to predict, I search in my database and I find the closest xi, and I use the label for that xi as my prediction. And that becomes my one nearest neighbor prediction. So first question, why am I using Euclidean, so L2 squared Euclidean norm? Let me see. I see an answer for convenience. Anyone have any other guesses? X is not part of my database. So X is a new point, but let's actually table that question about what happens if X is part of the data set for 2 seconds, and talk a bit about why we like Euclidean. Or maybe better, just what properties we need to have to get this to work well. Okay, so a lot of it will depend on defining the distance. Euclidean, and as mentioned, for this particular problem, Euclidean distance and Euclidean distance squared won't matter. If the question earlier was about squared particularly, squared is mathematically much more convenient to compute than the norm itself usually. Does anyone know why squared is more convenient, like distance squared?
Because the norm has a square root in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, yes. So no square roots. So in particular, if I give you some vector z, then E transpose z. This is supposed to be a 2. Okay, so this is easy. So I need to do something about this writing and freezing. So I will try to fix that by Friday. Apparently writing causes problems, but that's good to know. And apparently there's some voice issues as well, but it seems to highly correlate with when I try to write on the slides. So I will avoid writing on the slides for now. Okay, so if I am interested in computing the norm squared, it's sort of computationally quite easy. And so that's one of the reasons that L2 norm squared is quite common, because it's very computationally efficient to compute. So what I said, assuming the last part, is the definition of L2 norm squared, which is just the inner product, which is, I'm tempted to write, but I will not. But if you look up inner product, it's a sort of very simple definition by summing up the entries of the vector, each element squared. So it's very fast. So that's one of the reasons I think practically that L2 is popular. L2 squared is popular versus L2. However, I think many of you have correctly pointed out that the distance you choose matters a lot. We'll talk a bit more about distances when we talk about clustering. But for now, I think it's worth mentioning, and completely correct, that part of the problem specification is to pick a distance. And in fact, so let's get into this in 2 seconds, but you can do this. If I don't want to use L2 distance, I can use some other distance measure, and the behavior will change based on the distance. I'll defer some of the discussion of how distances change behavior to when we get to talking about clustering, because distances will play a prominent role there as well. But I think for now, it suffices to say that you can pick a distance measure that you think is appropriate for the problem, and different distance measures will actually lead you to sort of different kinds of prediction. What else might you change about this algorithm? So the first thing we've changed so far is we've said that maybe we don't like L2 squared, because say I'm working, all of my points are on a sphere, and you want to use the sort of the distance on the sphere is a much better notion of distance. And so that's what I'm going to use for my nearest neighbor as an example. What else might you change, maybe in chat, to help improve the properties? Okay, so I think there's another one, which I think is a great idea, is instead of just doing what is the closest neighbor and using that for a prediction, you might try to do more than one neighbor, so maybe 5 neighbors or 10 neighbors. Why might you use more than one neighbor? And say take a majority vote, as we're seeing. The unfortunate thing that I mentioned, sorry, K is find the closest neighbor. Yes, so the definition of K is the index of the closest neighbor. The unfortunate notation thing that I did, and I'll try to fix this when I upload the slides, is I'm using K for the index of the closest neighbor, and the algorithm is also called K nearest neighbors, and those Ks are very different K. The K in K nearest neighbors is the K in the number of, the K in K nearest neighbors is number of points that you're averaging, which is the sort of majority vote that you're doing. So that's where the K shows up. So I think a lot of the answers I'm seeing are really good answers. So by averaging many neighbors, it tends to be much more robust to noise. So if 2 points by chance happen to be close to each other, but the patterns are very different, by averaging lots of points, I can better sort of get better, more stable local patterns as opposed to a pattern from a single point. I think outliers are also a great example. I'm tempted again to draw on this slide, but I think, yeah, I'll avoid that again. So you can have outliers that are points that are very far from the rest of the data, where the nearest neighbor is not really representative, but maybe averaging over many neighbors is much more meaningful. It also can help avoid some of the worst and sort of most egregious issues with image corruption. I think this is true. So using more than one neighbor is a good idea. So one question is, what is the arg min? So min is the minimum, which is the smallest, the value that gives me the smallest norm. So if I look at every example, each example, I compute the norm distance between the L2 distance between the point and the query point. And I can get the minimum of these distances. But what I really care about is not the value of the distance, but the index of the distance. So what arg does is the argument that achieves the minimum. This is important. This will come up again when we talk about optimization later on. So it's a good question to ask now. So the arg min is the argument. So which index is actually the smallest norm, as opposed to the value of the smallest norm itself, because the argument is what actually matters for specifying which neighbor to look at. So if I wanted to implement K nearest neighbors, then the naive way to do it would be run, actually, it's not a good chat question, so I'll describe it. A naive way to do it would be search in my database, find the nearest neighbor, so that becomes my first nearest neighbor, remove that, search again, and get the second nearest neighbor, and maybe do this K L different times. This gives me a set of nearest neighbors. then I can do a majority vote between those nearest neighbors. Can someone describe what a majority vote is? So if I give you a set of neighbors, each one of them is giving me a different prediction. What would a majority vote do with that set of neighbors? Okay, yeah. So you can think of each prediction as a vote, and a majority vote is picking the vote that shows up most often. How would I, so one really nice property of nearest neighbors is that in many ways it's a close to universal algorithm. If I want to do this, we'll talk about self-classification in 2 seconds. But if I wanted to do binary classification with just 2 labels, so Y can only be yes or no. If I wanted to do K classes, the same exact algorithm works with a minor tweak. It also works for structure predictions. Suppose my output is an entire graph, for instance. In some ways, nearest neighbors is very flexible to having sort of quite complicated output spaces, which is one really nice property that allows you to sort of approach, I think, many hard problems as a good sort of default first machine learning algorithm. Self-classification. So the idea of self-classification is instead of saying which class a particular point is, I want to give it a score that's correlated with how confident I am that this point is in a certain class. There are a variety of tricks to try and do this. I'll defer bits because I think it's in the details. And we'll mostly do sort of, at least for the beginning of the class, we'll do what is known as hard classification, which is predict an actual label. I'll defer this to discussion offline, so we can ping if you're interested in thinking about how to approximate a probability score as opposed to just predicting a specific label, for an example. In most settings, we try to make actual predictions, and we'll mostly use that point of view for the class. There was another question earlier on about what if a point actually shows up in the database. So in that case, kind of makes your problem easy, because if a point is actually part of the database, then its nearest neighbor is itself. And so then it's easy, that becomes the solution of the minimum. So let's say many points are nearest neighbors, then what is most common is again to that is sort of most likely, each outputs that shows up most like video as well, because I don't think we need video. I'm realizing now that the lag may be internet related and may not be due to writing. I'm going to attempt writing again in a second, and maybe someone tells me if that specific correlation of writing and lag happens. So one good question that showed up was, what happens to linearity of k nearest neighbors? So quick poll question from the class, and sort of anyone can answer. Okay, so is nearest neighbor a linear algorithm? Maybe you can just guess yes, no. Okay, so when we say linear, the definition of linear, and I'm going to attempt writing, is, so let's say these are one class and these are another. So one of the things that we'll end up doing is, okay, so it might just be video and bad internet. So here's an example that you can easily see. And here, if I wanted to predict that, I figured out for every point, what the prediction will be. The decision boundary will look something like this. And so what this means is that in the space of the data and the space of the features, the prediction is highly nonlinear. So in contrast, something like a linear algorithm can only predict linear separators. So similar example, but something that would, in a linear algorithm, you expect the answer to be a line that separates the points. So there's a bit of nuance, which is not super important, I think, for the discussion we're having now. But in general, k-nearest neighbors is considered a nonlinear algorithm. So interestingly, we're starting with a nonlinear algorithm. By the next lecture, we'll flip over to linear and spend at least a couple of lectures on linear algorithms, and then we'll switch back when we get to deep learning to talk again about nonlinear algorithms. But in the space of the features, the predictors that you get from nearest neighbors will be sort of nonlinear separate. We'll talk about its other properties later on when we talk about, say, generalization, but it's considered a good sort of first algorithm to try when you're trying to build machine learning predictors. Okay. So the question is about linear versus nonlinear. So the definition of linear is not in terms of runtime or in terms of, the definition of linear is in terms of the function, the prediction function. So the prediction function is an output mapping y, which is equal to f of x. And when we say linear, we typically are asking if this function is a linear function. And a linear function has to be something that looks like W transpose X. So if the function that makes a prediction is W transpose X, then we consider it a linear function. We'll complicate the matters a little bit when we talk about feature extraction and kernels and things like that. But as a rough rule of thumb, the linearity versus nonlinearity is in terms of the functional mapping, not in terms of anything else, at least in terms of what we'd like to use for categorizing machine learning algorithms. And from this point of view, the decision boundary that you can get from nearest neighbor can be highly nonlinear. So it's far away from what you get from a linear function. Okay, so hopefully that answers that question. Okay, so here's an example. Here's a real data set. And we have sort of circles and X's. And here's an example of what you get as a decision boundary. And again, you can see that it does a reasonably good job in this setting. It's able to pick out most of the, get good sort of error on the data that it can see. We'll talk a lot about generalization later on and whether this is a good generalizing solution. And how we think about sort of what properties lead to likely better generalization. And in particular, how we might tweak something like nearest neighbor to generalize better. Okay, so there's a question about the boundary having islands. Remember, the boundary is determined by nearest neighbor for every single point. So say a point that is right here, its nearest neighbor is some little set of points. Like all those points in that ball, actually away from that blue point, will end up being nearest neighbors to that point. So easily you can end up with islands. So if I end up with a red point here, then its nearest neighbors will be here. And you can have a set of reds that is far away from any of the other crosses. So that happens quite often. And it's a property of something like nearest neighbors. And actually that's a good thing that you pointed out, because that seems bad. We'll try to make this intuition of this flexibility good and bad, whether it's good and bad later. We'll try to formalize this idea a little bit more in the future when we talk about generalization. But I think the intuition that seems to be building in the class, and I think it's the right intuition, is that we typically like stuff like simpler decisions seem to be better decisions. We'll try to make this more formal, but this is the intuition that we typically build machine learning algorithms with. So simpler would be something that doesn't have islands, for instance, which we think that will likely lead to better outcomes. And remember, our goal in building these machine learning algorithms is generalization. So what we want is that if I apply this algorithm to completely new data that I haven't seen, it makes good predictions. And there's an intuition, which again, we'll try to make formal and more precise as we go along, that islands of decisions are probably not stable and probably not sort of good predictions for good generalization. Why will this count as two groupings in the first place? Edward, can you expand on that? I don't understand the question. I'll move on, but I'll try to answer the question if you can expand a bit. Okay, so I'll skip this discussion because I think we already had some of this. But some of the shortcomings of nearest neighbors include sort of potential noisiness, so high noise. I think another issue with nearest neighbors is in order to make a prediction, it sort of has low training complexity. Fit the parameters that I use to make the prediction. Okay, so there might be a correlation after all between writing and lagging. Anyways, so low training complexity. I'll write one more time just to finish this out. And this is because on hand, I need to search through the entire data set in order to make a prediction for a particular example. I really apologize about the lags. We'll try to improve it over time. Some of this is unavoidable. If it gets, well, we'll see. Worst case, we might try pre-recording lectures and avoiding sort of real timing. We'll see. We'll see how good or bad it is. So the first point was low training complexity. This is the idea that so the low training complexity is that the training there's no training process. So that the model is the whole data set. So this is nice because training is free. I highlight this because as we come to other algorithms in machine learning, we'll see that actually in most algorithms, most of your effort is at training time. So training time takes a lot of effort and then the prediction is cheap. Nearest neighbor, interestingly, is the exact opposite. So it's a setting where there's no training because the model is the entire data set. But this is good questions. So the question is about what complexity means, but training is cheap, test is expensive. When I say complex, okay. So computational complexity is sort of how much computation I need in order to run the algorithm. So in order to run training, it's free. In order to run testing, I have to run a search every time I need to run a test. And what may not be obvious is that as the data set gets larger, this search gets more and more expensive to where it can very quickly completely overwhelm everything that you're doing. So in particular, search starts to scale with how big the data size is in terms of number of samples, but it also scales with the dimensionality of the data set. So if I have really high dimensional data and or high number of samples, the search complexity can be very expensive. And so that makes this algorithm potentially quite slow in practice. Okay, so switching over the menu of applications of ML, we'll talk a bit about, say, image classification, which is, I think, one of the most popular in academia applications, video segmentation, lots of cases where machine learning works pretty well. So here, image segmentation problems where the models work quite well. There are other cases where it works well. The slides will be up online, so you can look at some of these in detail. But there are also lots of cases where the models can fail quite badly. So for instance, the image on the right is being predicted as a horse standing in the middle of a road, I believe. Middle of a road, whereas there's no horse in the picture. So we'll talk a bit about sort of when even highly sophisticated models can fail and why that happens. Okay, so lots of fun applications. to, again, segmentation, question answering. I'm going to skip this discussion. The horse is not invisible. That's a good call. It's actually a fun, maybe extra discussion about why stuff like that happens. I think, as we'll find, a lot of predictions come from context. And so it's very easy, exactly. The background issue, I think, is really the key issue there. Regardless, in terms of sort of factually, the answer was wrong. And so as an example of failure, even though I think one could explain afterwards why it didn't work. Okay, so here's a fun sort of figure from paper that you can look up offline that says when we think that an AI will be created that will exceed human performance. I think it's not clear that many of these things have happened yet, but some of them seem to have. So I think it's an interesting read. You can maybe take a look offline if you're interested. I want to switch gears. I will skip the quiz because we have 2 minutes and talk 1 minute and talk very briefly about just class setup. Everything about the course is online. It should be the easiest place to get access is to go to Relate, which many of you I think already know if you're in this lecture. Important FAQ things. If you want to know what technical background you need, generally some basic linear algebra, probability stats. There's a quiz that I asked, not a quiz, a survey I asked everyone to fill out. Please take a look, and if possible, fill those out. We'll tell you a bit about the background you need. Specifics about background, take a look at homework 0, which will, I think, give you more detail on the probability and statistics that you need to do well in the course. If you hate math, this course may be tricky for you because we actually, part of our goal is to go into fundamentals of algorithms and why and when they work or don't work. If you really don't want to do any of that, you should consider some like the applied machine learning course, which is much closer to applied than conceptual. Okay, homework 0 is apparently not up. We'll fix that by the end of the lecture. Sorry about that. We have a link, but apparently we haven't released it. We'll fix that. Okay, if you really want math, we do some. We are not even close to sort of fully mathematically rigorous. I'd suggest like potentially one of the machine learning theory courses to go into a lot more detail on mathematical fundamentals. If you only want to do deep learning work, I think this may be tricky. We cover deep learning, but we cover a lot of other stuff. So you may consider, say, a specific deep learning class. And often computer vision and NLP courses do a lot of deep learning. So that'd be a good place to go. I would also say the same is true if you are, okay. So cool. So someone mentioned 598 DLT. So take a look at that as well if you're interested in that. I think the same is true if you're interested in a particular package. We mostly would code in pure Python apart from the project. So if you're interested in, say, I want to really learn PyTorch, then I actually think they're really good tutorials that are a better source for something like this than a class. Sorry, I paused because I was reading the question. We will, so I think I'll just answer the question, what is this class for? So this class is in the middle of theory and applied. Compared to pure theory, we try to give context and applications and we build fundamentals, but we also try to see how these fundamentals apply to real problems. It's meant to be a good sort of baseline course to either go and develop your own algorithms in real problems without necessarily proving everything, say from scratch, which would be what you'd be learning in theory class, but also more conceptual than a pure applied class. So you can maybe understand the details of why something might work or not work. And so that's what it's billed as. That's what we're targeting. It's also, I think, for people who are graduate students, many graduate students require this class to take the qualifier for AI. So it's targeted also at sort of the basics we expect from an AI student who's going to move on to either take more theory or more applied cloud courses. More FAQ. We don't have a waiting list. Anyone that wants can sign up. Almost everyone that wants to get into class eventually gets in. So I don't think that'll be a problem. You're also free to audit. Please do not submit any of the course assignments if you're auditing, because that is a lot of extra work for the course staff. And we'll be checking on this as we go along. For homework, it's going to be, I apologize, I know that we're over time. If you need to go, I understand. This will be recorded. You can take a look offline or look at the slides. I'm just going over course material right now. So we're going to have roughly 5 homeworks, not counting homework 0, which is not graded. Each homework is going to be roughly half written problems, typesets. We strongly suggest you use LaTeX, but typesetting is fine. And half would be machine problems in Python. We're going to have a course project at the end of the course. Details will come later. We strongly encourage working in groups. In fact, one of the questions is no writing by hands. It has to be typeset. We take this actually quite seriously. So typesetting somehow for every homework. Thanks for asking the question. It comes up every year. Feel free to work in a group. You must write your own solution, and you should add the names of the collaborators that you worked with on the homework. So we actually highly encourage group work, but we also want to, for sort of academic integrity reasons, want to make clear who worked together. We check this as well. So if your homework looks the same as someone else's, but their name is not on your homework, or if it looks the same, the name is on there, but it looks identical, both of those are problems. So we want to avoid that both of those issues come up. Grades would be the standard rubric. We generally tend to curve. Curving tends to be helpful. Due dates will be generally midnight on the date that's specified. Between 3 and 4 credits. The 4 credits, folks have to do a little bit more work. We ask them to scribe. We'll start from next lecture. And a few additional tasks on the project potentially. We're still deciding that. And the grading is a bit stricter. Details on the website. Roughly the 3 credits students can actually drop an exam, whereas the 4 credits folks cannot. You can have extra participation credits. We'll mostly be using Piazza, but we might look at other options for participation credit as the semester goes along. All of the slides are PowerPoint, are LaTeX Beamer slides, so there is no PowerPoint to release. Again, this is often asked, so I want to mention this. All of the slides would be available on Piazza before every single lecture. So you can always take a look there. We try to add links also on the course website. Sometimes those links are slow, but there will always be course slides before lecture, and then the annotated slides after will also be put on Piazza. So you can always take a look at the resources page of Piazza for course slides. Please don't email us, either me or any of the course staff. Please use Piazza. It's a big class, lots of material, lots of students. Email gets way overwhelming. At some point, we will stop answering emails, and you can only contact us during the class through Piazza. Okay, thank you for your attention. Thank you for the class. There's some tech issues, growing pains we'll try to fix through. But hopefully this was interesting, and hopefully many of you have learned something. We're looking forward to a fun semester. Thank you very much. Thank you. Take care.